Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Button Man by Mark Pryor. Narrated by Todd Mclaren. Chapter 1. London, England, 2008. Hugo turned the corner onto Gable Street, the growl of London's evening traffic fading away behind him. The winter sun had set an hour ago, and the damp evening settled itself comfortably over the city, bringing with it one of London's famous fogs, a slow creeper that followed Hugo from the Whitechapel station, stalking him every step of the way. By the time he reached the entrance to the alleyway at the south end of Gable Street, the fog had swallowed up the first of the terraced houses behind him. Hugo looked back at the remaining homes for signs of life. A few windows glowed yellow behind tightly drawn curtains, but that was all. He stood at the mouth of the alley, the reason he was here, and peered into its darkness. Under his feet, the gray concrete of the sidewalk gave way to ancient cobblestones, worn smooth by the feet of man and beast, now shiny with the damp of the evening. Overhead, the night sky was moonless, the stars already snuffed out by the gathering mist. As Hugo peered into the alley, the blackness seeped across the cobblestones toward him. He raised his shoulders and shivered against a chill that was real, or mostly real. Above his head, a gentle breeze rattled the branches of an old oak tree that reached out from the cemetery next door, sending a soft shower of rain pattering onto his hat. He put out a hand and brushed his fingers against the rough brick wall. It was damp, and his fingertips came away grimy. 200 years of London soot, he thought, and Gable Street had changed very little in that time. He'd read about this place, but had never been here. He'd first heard about it from a colleague in the FBI's behavioral profiling unit, a man almost as obsessed with unsolved murders as Hugo. And now he was here for the same reason he always visited a crime scene: to make contact with the victim and with the killer. He'd come at dusk on purpose, a time when the senses were keenest. He was no believer in the supernatural, but there had always been something about the death of a day, the hour of the rising of night, that tugged at the part of Hugo that connected most easily with those he hunted. Or used to hunt. He didn't do that anymore. Have cases. He'd solved his last just 2 days before quitting the bureau for the State Department, and now, as head of security for the U.S. Embassy in London, he had duties and responsibilities, employees, and high-level meetings with the CIA. But no cases. 100-year-old murder in the grimy back streets of London wouldn't be his anyway. A good thing, considering it was all but unsolvable. There was no evidence left, of course. Nothing to tag and bag, even to see. So the only connection he could make was through those unnamed senses that fed information to the nerves and the mistier corners of the brain. Pretty much all Hugo could do, with no evidence and no jurisdiction, was stand in the dark alley with the fog slinking around him, and hope that he could recreate the fear, generate and experience the creeping sense of menace that lived in darkest London, in the places like this, where evil deeds were committed and where time seemed unable to wipe them away. He started into the alley. The cobbles were hard and smooth beneath the soles of his cowboy boots. The light from Gable Street faded, and he stopped to let his eyes adjust to the gloom. A soft, wet smell reached his nostrils. Damp earth and something rotting. Vegetable, not animal. To his right, A 20-foot brick wall secured the perimeter of a former coal yard, a place now used mostly as a scrap heap for old cars. To his left, another high wall kept vagrants and ne'er-do-wells out of Whitechapel Cemetery. He moved forward, his left hand deep in his coat pocket, fingers wrapped around a flashlight, not switched on because he didn't want to spoil the mood. 3/4 of the way down the alley, he stopped, took off his hat, and looked down. Here, on the right side of the alley, is where she'd been found, tucked in the lee of the wall, stretched out with her fingers toward Gable Street, her feet pointing toward the iron gates of the foundry that dead-ended the alley. Nothing more than a drunk and a prostitute. She died in December 1905 at the hands of an unknown killer who, the police had insisted, was not Jack the Ripper. Her head had been sliced open, 1 or 2 hard blows crushing her skull, and her throat cut down to the spine. Half naked and not wearing shoes, the police surgeon found no evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. She'd bled to death on the cobbles, found by a fellow prostitute who'd gone into the alley with a customer and come out in shock. The dead woman was Meg Prescott, her body identified by a woman who sometimes shared her tiny ground-floor room on Dorset Street, a stone's throw away, and described by the Daily Mail at the time as the worst street in London. There, the 2 women spent their days drinking to excess and entertaining men. Or, as the friend told police, they worked as seamstresses, a polite fiction the police observed back then, at least until things got really nasty. Oddly, when police searched her house the night she was killed, police found the door unlocked and blood on Meg Prescott's bed. Hugo knelt and put his right hand on the cold stones, finally bringing out the flashlight with the other. He switched it on, the light blanching out the cobbles, showing him nothing. Poor Meg, her death unavenged, her murder forgotten. Not even a part of the many Ripper tours that momentarily chilled the spirits of ghoulish visitors to London. He looked back the way he'd come, the way the killer had fled that winter night. "I'd have caught you," he said quietly, "Jack or not." He stood up and cast the light around him. A trickle of water from the afternoon's drizzle ran along the gutter and into a drain, but there was nothing else to see. As he looked down at Meg Prescott's final resting place, another chill settled around his shoulders, and he shrugged it off before heading out back toward Gable Street, his footfalls echoing gently in the narrow confines of the alley. He turned right, walking alongside the low brick wall topped with iron railing that separated the street from the graveyard. 30 yards along, he reached the entranceway, a tall double gate that someone had forgotten to close. He paused and put a hand on the cold iron, but as he started to pull it shut, he paused. He wasn't ready to dispel the macabre cloak he'd pulled on, nor to leave the spirit of Meg Prescott entirely. He checked his watch. Not yet 6. Plenty of time until his rendezvous at the Coachman pub a mile away. He pushed the gate open and stepped inside. Ahead of him, the path curved away to the left, cutting diagonally through the churchless cemetery, whose gravestones tipped and tilted every way but upright. Decades, centuries even, of shifting earth and soggy days. Vandals that no graveyard custodian could keep out. The cemetery was large for central London, the size and shape of a football field, but the closeness of the rising fog and the heavy chill shrank it down, making it more intimate and personal. Hugo paused for a moment. He rested one hand on a moss-covered headstone and noticed the lack of traffic, the absence of construction noise. Standing here, London was silent. After a moment he pressed on and followed the gravelled path deeper through the uneven rows of markers, stopping occasionally to try and read the older ones, tracing his fingers over the soft, worn stones and the hard, disfiguring lichen. He was able to decipher first or last names, rarely both, and sometimes dates. No catchy epitaphs or sorrowful last words, just a fading catalogue of the dead, filed away in a quiet, tree-lined corner of London, perhaps waiting to be recycled when this patch of land became too valuable, and when the descendants of those who lay here had given up all pretense of aftercare. Or, maybe, had left the ranks of the living themselves. "A good night for ghosts," Hugo said aloud, smiling at an unexpected knot in his stomach. Despite his skepticism for ephemeral bodies, he had to concede that the wraiths of fog that drifted around him, obscuring the lights of the city and trapping the dark, made for a spectral scene of the first order. He stepped up the pace, returning to the path and making for the far side of the graveyard, where he assumed another gate would release him back into London's rush-hour traffic, and a little closer to the pub. He crested a slight rise and saw the gates in front of him, 20 yards away, and the twins of those that had let him in. He breathed a sigh of relief and tried to guess which major street would be closest, but stopped short when he saw movement to his right. He peered into the dark, but saw nothing except the last rows of markers, and beyond them, a line of oak trees as old and twisted as the stones. The fog shifted as a slight breeze rattled the upper branches of the oaks, and he saw movement again, conspicuous not because of how much it moved, but because of the way it moved. A long, narrow object dangling in the middle branches. A gentle sway, back and forth. Hugo dug his hands deeper into his coat pockets, feeling the reassuring weight of his flashlight. He moved forward, his jaw clenched. The wind rose again, and a few last leaves floated past his face as the branches above clattered more loudly. He lost sight of the object for a second, but as he drew nearer, he heard the faint creak of a rope above him. He looked up, his gaze trapped by a silhouette that slowly rotated in front of him, a figure that swayed in the breeze. Like a kaleidoscope image, the black limbs of the oak sank into the background, and the clear outline of a human form took shape. A human being, hanging from a rope that looped around its neck. He quick drew his flashlight, and the beam arrowed up, a weak light in the thick, pressing cemetery dark. As he watched, the body rotated toward him, and Hugo steeled himself to see the dead man's face, to see the sunken pits of his eyes and the sagging look that death painted on all his victims. But as it turned toward him, the body remained faceless, the beam of Hugo's flashlight ending in a blank and empty pool where the face should have been. Hugo looked harder, not understanding what he was seeing, until a momentary shift in the wind gave him a clearer view of the light-colored cloth covering the dead man's head. Chapter 2. Hugo removed his hat, an automatic display of respect. He looked around quickly, though not for anything or anyone in particular, then stepped closer to the dangling figure. For a split second he contemplated grabbing the legs, lifting the body high in case its owner wasn't yet dead, in case there was a chance that breath and life might yet be restored. He resisted the urge, and instead pressed his fingers against bare skin by the ankle, and the cold skin told him that the artery he was looking for no longer pulsed. In truth, Hugo had known from the figure's stillness that death had come and gone, his heart cold and without remorse, caring only that this empty shell, whoever it was, remained in his graveyard as lifeless as its other residents. The indignity of how this person had died would be addressed later. The sacred rites of the living imposed on this corpse by family and friends. For now, though, nothing could be disturbed, because for Hugo, the only thing more sacred than death was a crime scene. A fresh spatter of rain fell about him, and he started to worry about preserving evidence. His mind took him away from the macabre scene, switching off his emotional senses and firing up his physical ones, letting him rely on careful observation to detach him from the horror of a human being hanging from a tree, and to put him into the protective zone in which he'd lived as an FBI agent. He looked around, eyes scanning the ground, not sure what to look for other than something that shouldn't be there. But the ground gave nothing away, dusted with dead leaves, littered with broken twigs and the occasional branch. He couldn't even see his own footprints in the damp earth, but he knew which way he'd come, and moved slowly backward in that direction. He stopped 10 yards away, took another look at the dangling figure, and pulled out his cell phone. Slowly and calmly, he identified himself to the emergency operator and explained what he'd found. As he spoke, the wind rose again, turning the body slowly and setting the limbs of the oak tree chattering with excitement. He followed an elderly couple into the pub, holding the door for them as they wiped their feet on the mat outside. As he waited, a patient smile on his face, he looked into the room for the man who had brought him to London 6 months ago, Ambassador John Delaney Cooper. He saw him perched at a small table beside the fireplace, talking with the landlord, Al Grafton. The old publican knelt by the hearth, striking matches at scrunched-up balls of faintly damp newspaper, which he swore were harder to get going, but burned hotter once lit. The room already glowed golden from its yellow lamps, and Hugo felt the warmth drift over to meet him. The elderly woman finally finished wiping her feet and reached for her husband's arm, giving Hugo an apologetic smile and a nod of thanks. Inside the room they stopped again, this time to help each other out of their coats, but they stood to one side of the door, letting Hugo pass. Hugo approached his boss. "Mr. Ambassador," he said, offering a hand. "I've told you before, it's John," the seated man corrected. It was their routine. Cooper was Mr. Ambassador at the embassy, but insisted on John after hours. A willowy figure, Cooper had large, sad eyes and a drooping mustache to match, though his personality was far from forlorn. In fact, before they met, Hugo had been warned of a playboy diplomat, and there was no doubt that Ambassador Cooper had a penchant for life's pleasures. These included an ever-roving eye and frequent late-night visits to the ambassadorial residence from a string of different ladies, providing endless gossip to his staff. Informal in dress and manner, his preference was for backstreet pubs over white linen restaurants, and Hugo had found him more of a harmless Epicurean than a cavalier libertine. Good company on cold nights like this. "Beer?" Cooper asked. "I'll get it. You need a refill?" "You know I do. I have a tab running. Stick 'em on that." "Yes, sir, Mr. Ambassador." Hugo smiled. He dropped his hat and coat on the third chair at the table and headed for the bar. They came here once a week, sometimes more, for the booze, the food, and the 2 pretty barmaids. Cooper's generous tips had been instantly welcome, and the Americans were soon on first-name terms with Lucy and Jen. President George W. Bush was on the television behind the bar, near the end of his second presidency, and looking tired, Hugo thought. Politics touched his own job often enough, and Hugo couldn't fathom the pressures heaped on the world's most powerful man. "Hi, Hugo. The usual?" Jen asked, barely looking up. "Please." Hugo looked around as he waited. Ambassador Cooper stretched back languidly in his seat, feet stretched toward the fire. Al, father to Lucy, had managed to get it going, and the flames were devouring the last of the newspaper and kindling, crackling and popping the way a young fire should. The other 15 or so tables were filling slowly. City types grabbing a quick pint before heading home, and early diners who knew that the cottage pie would be gone by 8, maybe before. In the far corner of the room a man sat by himself, broad-shouldered and watchful, a newspaper and a glass of water on the table in front of him. Hugo caught his eye and nodded. The man nodded back, folded his newspaper and stood. Hugo waited as he brought his glass to the bar. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Bart," Hugo said to the man. "Got held up. I'll tell you about it tomorrow." "No problem, sir." "Stay and have a drink with us?" "Not tonight, sir." Bart winked. "Getting a babysitter for Amy and taking a date to the theater." "Get going, then." Hugo was delighted to hear that his colleague and friend was going on a date. Denham had been raising his daughter, Amy, since his wife had been killed in the same car crash that took Hugo's wife, Ellie. Since then, Denham had focused all his attention on his daughter, wrapping her in cotton wool and letting no other woman near him or his precious girl. Hugo smiled. "Glad to hear it. Have fun. And have her call me if she's upset about you being late." "I will. Good night, sir." "Good night." He turned to the bar as Jen appeared with the drinks. "Here you go, love," she said. "John's tab?" "That's the one. Thanks." Cooper sat up as Hugo arrived with the jugs of beer. He nodded toward the door that Bart had just closed behind him. "If I have to have a bodyguard everywhere I go, could you at least find one who'll sit and have a beer with me?" "Sure," said Hugo, sitting opposite his boss and with his back to the wall. "Of course, if I saw him do that, I'd have to fire him." "Not if I fired you first." "True. So I need to tell you why I was late." "Don't worry about it." Cooper held up a silencing hand. "You'll want to hear about a little task I have for you." "Right. You said on the phone you had something new and interesting for me to do." "Yes." Cooper stooped to his beer, taking the top inch of it off with a practiced slurp. He sat back and wiped his mustache with the back of his hand. "Good stuff. A little high profile, this endeavor, which is why I want you on it, personally." Hugo raised an eyebrow. "Not sure I like the sound of that." "Me neither, frankly. But I have a boss, too, and she's paying attention for once." "Okay." Hugo watched Cooper over the rim of his beer glass. "That little accident that made the front pages," Cooper said. "Accident?" "Yes. The one involving Dayton Harper and his lovely wife." "Ginny Ferro. What does that have to do with us?" The accident Cooper was talking about involved 2 of Hollywood's up-and-coming movie stars. 2 days previously, while shooting a movie in Hertfordshire, they disappeared from the set in Harper's convertible Jag. The newspaper stories were sparse, but the headlines had screamed to the world that they'd run down a local farmer and sped away. leaving him to bleed to death in a ditch beside a winding country lane. An eyewitness and a damaged hood had led the police to Harper and Ferro, who quickly confessed and, from jail, threw themselves on the mercy of the British public. "That's what I wondered," Cooper frowned. "Only it seems that our Dayton Harper was born as Dayton Horowitz, the son of a certain Jasper Horowitz. The guy who owns half of Texas, most of its oil, and almost all of its water rights. You know him?" "Of him. As does everyone who grew up in Texas. And you either love him or hate him. Which is it for you?" Hugo smiled into his pint. "No comment. Not that it matters. Jasper Horowitz is also a huge supporter of my boss's boss. Not that the Secretary of State or the Prez have put any pressure on me directly, of course. Oh, no, of course not. But if you know what's good for you, you'll pitch in and do your bit, right?" "Right. Which is where you come in." Hugo sat back and looked at his boss. "Wait, don't tell me—" "I'm afraid so. Harper is getting out of jail tomorrow morning, and I need you to look after him." "For how long?" "As long as it takes. Though I don't know what 'it' means in this situation." Cooper sipped his beer. "As you might know, and if you don't, you'll soon learn, a large part of your job will be babysitting." "That's fine. I don't mind." "I appreciate that. A movie star could be interesting, if a little high maintenance." "Better an actor than a politician," Hugo said with a smile. "Oh, you'll get one of those sooner or later, don't you worry." "I'll manage. So the tabloids have people pretty riled up about this accident, huh?" "Putting it mildly." Cooper grimaced. "He's lucky they don't have the death penalty here." "Maybe." A thought struck Hugo. "Doesn't he have bodyguards of his own? He can certainly afford them." "Probably. But the last set didn't keep him out of trouble. And even if he does have them, and they manage to stick with him, the last thing we need is half a dozen freelance American bodyguards beating up outraged members of the British public." Cooper drained his glass and licked his lips. "He's a U.S. citizen accused of a serious crime and in potential danger of vigilante justice. Movie star or otherwise, he deserves our protection." "Fair enough." Hugo smiled to show there were no hard feelings. "But I'd be happier sticking close to his wife." Cooper chuckled. "You and the rest of the male world." He cleared his throat and looked around the pub. "And that's where this gets a little delicate." "How so?" "She's already been released. This morning. Kind of an administrative cock-up, actually. Her bail was paid, and she was supposed to be held until tomorrow, when she and her husband would go home with us. With you." "So what happened?" "We're not too sure. That's the delicate part. Apparently some flunky looked at her paperwork, opened her cell door, and handed her a bus pass into London. No doubt she's hiding in a beauty salon or a coffee shop somewhere, getting a good haircut with any luck." "I see." Hugo nodded. "And you don't want hubby to know she's on her own." "Correct. If he finds out, his father finds out." "Your boss finds out." Cooper shrugged. "That's the gist of it. Plus, the more people who know, the more likely the media find out. Talk about vigilante justice." He shuddered, then picked up his empty glass. "Still, that's tomorrow's business." He looked at his watch and then toward the bar. "Cottage pie should still be available. My treat." Hugo stood and collected their glasses. "I'll order and get refills." The secret, Al had told them a few months back, was to use lamb, not mutton. and let it soak in red wine for a few hours. Warm red wine, apparently. And
Sample complete. Ready to continue?